Does it mean that does it mean when we read the Bible, we need to just take the literal aspect of it, not any interpretations of what we think ourselves? Like sometimes when we read, right, when we read the Bible, every time we get a different perspective of the Bible, right? So that's the beauty of the Bible also. That whenever you read it, you get different inspiration, different thought process, which may not be literally written there, but then kind of different perspective of that particular passage. So I was trying to relate, is he trying to say that we should not be uh, taking our own interpretation rather than literally look at what exactly happened? Is that what he meant? I'm just thinking out loud here.
Well, yeah, when we read the Bible, everybody, this is what I tell my students all the time. Whenever we read the Bible, there is no such thing as objective reading. In other words, everybody comes to the biblical text with something. Let's say here's a biblical text, and then you just came back from visiting a family who lost somebody in an accident. On your way back, you may see your life in a different light, right? You may say on the way, oh boy, how fragile human life
Mhm.
is, right?
Right.
With that perspective, when you read the same text, you may read it in a very different way from the way you used to read the same text. In other words,
Hmm.
we all have things going on in our minds and heart. So, like it or not, it's the way it is. Everybody, okay, if somebody sent me an email, let's say somebody sent me an email last evening, it was not really face to face conversation, okay? Somebody sent me an email. When I was reading that email, I was very angry, very upset from another thing. It has nothing to do with this email or the person who sent me this email, okay? I was already angry with something, and then when I read this email, I may misinterpret
Hmm.
because about something, because of a situation I had been in. That's how we are human as a human beings. So when we read the biblical text, there are when two people read the same text, each of them may have different thoughts just because of who we are. So when he said, when we read the scripture, there are certain window, there are certain lens we use to read or interpret the biblical text. That's what everybody is doing, in fact.
Okay.
Like it or not.
Hmm.
So, so I think he's saying that there are so many different ways of reading. It's so natural. Even if we read the same gospel, same Mark's gospel, and people all look at from different perspective, a different way, different angle. So, so all these scholars, all these people, I told you I have several books on this topic, four gospels of one Jesus. I have at least four different authors, and then they all say different things. But they have their own consistency. They have their own logic. Yeah, it's just the way we are doing. So we cannot say, "Oh, your reading is wrong." Instead of saying that, "Oh, that's interesting. Your reading and my reading, and also my reading 10 years ago and my reading now is different." It's just natural. But I think this author is providing, what he's providing is this. Let's say, he said, it's very interesting. When he talked about Mark's gospel, remember last week when we ended with this, when he's talking about Mark's gospel, no human being ever said the Son of God, right?
Right.
Except the demons at the beginning.
The demons.
The demons, and at the end, there's a Roman centurion, right? So Mark 15, verse 39, this Roman soldier, officer, right? An officer who has 100 soldiers under his authority. He said he was the Son of God.
Hmm.
That really stayed with me for a while. So, but same story in Luke's gospel. It's very different. In Luke's gospel, also Luke is talking about this Roman soldier. If you see Luke 23:47, Prashant, can you read Luke 23:47?
Yeah.
I'll have to get my Bible out.
Right.
Luke 23:47. 47.
Verse
The
47, please. Just
centurion.
wait till Anne opens it.
Yeah, I got to get my Bible. Luke 23.
So we are comparing Mark 15:39 and Luke 23:47.
Luke 23:47. I'm almost there.
Okay.
Okay, I've got it. I'm here.
The centurion, seeing what had happened, praised God and said, "Surely this was a righteous man."
Oh,
This
the Luke's gospel centurion says this was a righteous man. He doesn't say son of God, right?
Right.
But in Mark 15:39, let's go back to
surely
Mark 15:39.
15:39.
Okay, I've got it.
Read it, please.
And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, "Surely this man was the Son of God."
Different, right?
Different, yeah.
So, one legitimate question is why different? Well, probably another different question is why the way they saw Jesus on the cross was different? Why were their perspective were different? I would say. You could certainly ask that. Your question could be like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So righteous man and son of God, different concept. You know, I talked about this. In Luke's gospel, Jesus is not really crying that hard, right? He says, into your hand I commit my spirit. In Luke's gospel, when he is dying on the cross, he doesn't say, God, why have you forsaken me? He's just saying, into your hands I commit my spirit. In other words, in Luke's gospel, Jesus is described as somebody who was willingly give his life for the salvation of all humanity. So he knew why he has come to the world. So instead of crying hard and then felt abandonment, he's saying, into your hands I commit my spirit. But in Mark's gospel and Matthew's gospel, he's just crying hard. Especially in Mark's gospel. The tone is very heavy. From the very first to the end, it is moving so fast, and then tone is heavy, and then people are afraid. There's a lot of fear, and people are confused. And then, really, Mark's gospel, early part of chapter 16, the disciples were all confused, and then this author, the British scholar, he said, when they were confused, they would not give an answer at the empty tomb. So people started asking why these are different. Well, he mentions in Mark's gospel, when the Mark's gospel was written, it was around the time when Jerusalem temple came down. It was right after the Jerusalem temple came into pieces. So they are all Jewish Christians, they are all Jewish people, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that temple was everything. And then temple, they believed temple was where the God was residing, basically. There's no way for them to believe the temple can be destroyed. No way. How is it possible? But it did happen. So basically, they were all confused. They were at a loss. And then they couldn't find an answer. These Roman soldiers, they were evil, basically. Roman Empire was evil because their temple was destroyed in the war with the Roman soldiers, Roman Empire. There was a revolt against Roman power, and then that is what happened. When temple came down, so many Jewish people left the country, and then that is how the Jewish diaspora started. That's why we still have Jewish people all over the world. That is when people just left the country. 2,000 years later, we're still having all these Jewish people all over the world. So when that happened, when the temple came down, and that is also when Christians were all persecuted. So the mood was so heavy, and then they didn't know, they couldn't find their answer. And then for them, they try to make a connection with the Jesus death in Mark's gospel. So just like the disciples were all confused when Jesus died. In other words, all the Christians were confused in that time, and then they were confused. They didn't know what to do. They couldn't really make sense. So by telling Jesus' story, this aspect of Jesus' death, I think they are trying to comfort the Christian community that way. In other words, they may have said, you know what? We are all confused, but we are not the only ones. When Jesus died 30 years ago, 40 years ago, everybody was confused. Probably Mark's author, the writer of a Mark's gospel, was trying to reach out to his community, saying that, hey, now we are all confused. We are all sad. We are all devastated when we see this temple, come down. But we are not the only ones. When Jesus died 30 years ago, all the disciples were like that.
And they were all fearful too.
Right. Yeah. And then eventually, later part of chapter 16 of Mark's gospel, what does Jesus say? Let's take a look at it.
The 16th chapter.
Later part.
What?
Later part of 16th chapter, Mark's gospel. Let me.
Okay.
Is there a Great Commission? Or...
Yeah. So, okay. Many scholars say some translation of Luke's gospel ended at verse 8.
Yeah.
And then when I see here, verse 9, my Bible said certain copies don't have verses 9 through 20.
Yeah.
Right? So that means if that's true, in other words, if the original version of a Mark's gospel only had 8 verses in chapter 16, it really ended with the disciples confused.
Trembling and bewildered. I would be trembling and bewildered too.
That's Mark's gospel.
Mm-hmm.
And then, remember this? Disciples were not sure who Jesus was. Right?
Right.
Even though they were with the Jesus, they were not sure. Well, because when this thing happened, when the temple came down around the 70 AD, that's how people may have felt when they were going through this terrible, terrible destruction. Let's say, World War III happened, and then everybody's just this unthinkable catastrophe, happening around, everybody will say, "What's this?" Right? Why?
And
Confusion.
why?
So Mark's gospel ends with the confusion and chaos and fear, in fact. Yeah, but interesting. Verses 9 through 20, Jesus appears to his disciples, and then he tells them,
What chapter are you on?
chapter 16, Mark's gospel, chapter 16,
Yeah. What verse?
9.
verse
Because
9.
I don't have any verse 9 in my Bible.
Oh,
It
that's
ends at
interesting.
verse 8.
That's interesting.
Hmm.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's the evidence. Some Bibles don't have that.
Mhm.
But mine has 9 through 20.
Yeah.
9 through 20?
Yeah.
Verse 9 through verse 20.
Wow.
Yeah.
The last verses, they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid.
So, but in the later, so some people say probably this was added later on because some translations don't have this part.
Mm-hmm.
Some say probably it was added later on.
Yeah.
And then Jesus telling disciples to go, and then he tells them what to do, and then at the end, verse 19, it says, after the Lord Jesus had spoken to them, he was taken up into heaven, and he sat at the right hand of God. Then the disciples went out and preached everywhere. Probably whoever added this,
Hmm.
he was not satisfied, probably, the way it ended. But original Mark's gospel, that was the point. Confused, fear,
Mm-hmm.
not knowing what to do. That was the point, because his audience was in that situation. So that's a Mark. That's a gospel of a Mark's perspective of Jesus. For him, in other words, for him probably, Christian life can be full of fear sometimes. I think that's his message. Sometimes we don't know who Jesus is when you are suffering, especially
Mm-hmm.
when you are going through all these challenges in your life. So, in other words, he's saying it's okay to be confused.
Mm-hmm.
It's okay, because that's what happened to the first community, Mark's community. And not only that, even Jesus' first disciples, they didn't know what to do. So when you and I are confused and then we are full of a fear, that's okay. I think he's telling us that.
Mm-hmm.
That's his point.
That's his point.
That's his point. So that's one perspective, how we read Mark's gospel. But as we said, and then in this gospel, crying is very natural, right? Well, sure, absolutely, human beings, we cry.
Mm-hmm.
I think crying is the only way, in fact, right? What else would you do? You just cry. But that doesn't mean God is not there with you,
Mhm.
right? Yeah. Crying. It's okay to cry. That's a powerful, it's very powerful message.
Mhm.
So in other words, you know, it was only the demons and Roman soldier who knew who Jesus was.
This is in Mark's gospel specifically, right? In Mark's gospel, these are the two. Okay.
That's Mark's gospel. So indeed very interesting though.
Mm-hmm.
It is.
Yes, yeah.
Very interesting. It was a Roman soldier who said he was the son of God.
Mm.
Especially when they knew it was a Roman Empire who destroyed our temple. How about that, right? Instead of one of the disciples, it's a Roman soldier who said that. Very powerful, very strange, very interesting, right? So, Mark's gospel is really for the people who are suffering, people who lost everything, people who are dying tragically. The mood is sad, it's moving so fast. Mark's gospel there because the communities was in Christ. I mean, they were in crisis, right? So Mark, as an author of the gospel, he didn't have time. He was moving so fast because the community was in danger. And then it's short. He had to respond to the needs of people. So in a way, when he says that only it was a demons, not human being, not the disciple. Sometimes we think, well, probably demons are better than us.
I don't think so.
I mean, it really talks about weakness of human beings in a way, the ignorance of a human being, right? Sometimes it's true, right? I mean, I don't know whether you heard something like this or not. I mean, when I was at previous church, there was a lady. She became a pastor's wife, though later on. But this lady, sometimes she will call my wife. Sometimes during the night, at night when she was sleeping, a demon will attack her.
Mm.
Why? Because one time she was a fortune teller.
Mm.
Mm.
When you have a, what do you call, psychic reader?
Yeah.
We didn't know that she was a psychic reader.
Mhm.
So in other words, she made money out of this. And then that's what she did. That's what she used to do. But when she became a Christian, still all these demons, evil spirits, they wouldn't let her go. So sometimes she couldn't handle. Even if her husband was a retired pastor, I mean, they couldn't handle. And then she would call my wife to pray over the phone. When my wife prayed strongly over the phone, she came down. She
Mm.
was able to calm down, and then she was able to go to bed.
Go
No,
to sleep.
how
Wow.
can you explain all this? So sometimes the demons are demons are above people. I think Mark's gospel is telling us, yes, demons are stronger than we are. That's why we need Jesus, because Jesus comes to chase them away. Because all these miracle stories, right? All these healing stories. Well, the demons who said, "You are the the you are the one from something like that. You are Almighty Son, something like that, right? In Mark's gospel, right?" And then Jesus said, "Be quiet. Shut up," Jesus. And then he chased them away. So probably, in Mark's community, people people felt that they were under this under the power of something bigger than they were. And then that's why the author is emphasizing Jesus came to rebuke those demons. And then he was the one who basically um, uh, chased them away. And there was a freedom, healing. So the people in Merck's community, I think they were really under the oppression of not just probably, you know, this demon thing. Oh yeah, there's a one book. There's a one book, one author who wrote a book about Mark's gospel. Remember the Legion? Jesus is asking, "What is your name?" There's a guy around the tomb cemetery, right? He was hurting himself. Remember? And then people, because he was screaming all the time, they put shackles around him and then chained him, and so he couldn't move around. But he was screaming, right? And then Jesus came, and then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He said, "Legion," right? Legion. You know where that word came from? Is a Roman soldiers, a group of Roman soldiers, a legion. It's a military term.
Okay. Mhm.
It's a military term. Okay.
Mhm.
So demon said, I'm a legion, right?
Mm-hmm.
That means this particular author read Mark's gospel this way. I think at Mark's gospel, the author is really describing the people, Christian community under the oppression of this demonic power, which is Roman Empire.
Mhm.
Roman Empire. Isn't that
It says
interesting?
like large number of demons mirroring the size of a Roman legion, typically at
Roman, yeah,
6,000 soldiers. I just Googled it.
yeah. So I think in Mark's gospel is really he was aware of he was in that political situation, and then he is when Jesus came to free uh, this man, poor man who was possessed. He was really talking about his community people who were under the oppression of a Roman Empire. And then eventually Jesus was the one who freed him, right? The demons came out of him and then went into the um the pigs, right?
Pigs, yeah, group, yeah.
Yeah.
That's why there's a lot of pigs. So,
Uh, army of a pig. So yeah, so the bottom line is that each gospel each gospel has a different perspective to read, to see Jesus. Um, yeah. What else? What else do you have? Well, our time is almost up. Anne, did you have anything that?
Well, I was just so glad that you had talked to us last week about these four animals, the eagle, the lion, and I don't know, the angel, and
Isn't there
because
something?
he talked about that, and it wouldn't have made as much sense to me if you hadn't already introduced us to that. Then I kind of knew what he was talking about.
Isn't that very interesting?
It was very helpful that I had already, had that idea.
Yep.
Because it went so fast, I had trouble keeping up.
Yeah. Well, I had to watch it 3 times, you know?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I could watch it again because
Yeah.
I felt like I was missing things. But then
Oh, yeah.
okay, I'd go, I know what he's talking about
There's
now.
a lot of information. There's a lot of
A
information.
lot of information.
And then he's a British accent.
Yeah, yeah.
It's very interesting though, right? So, well, I hope everybody, you have, both of you have a wonderful evening. And so we're gonna
Okay.
take a
Yeah.
break. We're gonna take a break while Anne is away, and then
Okay.
and we'll have a wonderful, wonderful
I
trip.
will. I'll come back with wonderful stories and wonderful memories.
Okay. All
Okay.
right.
Thank you, Pastor.
Sure. Good night.
Good night. Thank you. Bye.